our final talk in our free speech series, and we're very excited to end with Casey Park joining us from UCLA. If you've been following the series, it's an event we've done all year to kind of complicate the idea of this being the University of Free Speech, and really trying to look at what does that mean and how might we complicate it. So we had Sarah Schulman in the fall, we had Chase Strangio from the ACLU, and we did a teach-in called Beyond Free Speech. And Casey Park came to our attention because of an op-ed she wrote last year in the New York Times about the ACLU needs to rethink its position on free speech. And so we're very excited to hear from her, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks to everyone for coming, and thank you so much to Kristen and Gina for inviting me, and to Tate for all the coordination. I'm really happy to be here. It's been a really big year for thinking about free speech, as you all know. And I really welcome the opportunity to think through the issue a little more with you all. So for me, the crux of the issue is an obvious paradox, which is that everyone knows that there is a profound causal connection between power and voice, between violence and silence. And everyone knows that America is a pretty violent place, characterized by massive power inequities. And somehow, still, there is no place for any discussion of structural violence, historical or ongoing, in the conversation about free speech. So what I want to talk about today revolves around a few main themes or ideas. The first is that I want to talk about speech itself, but also how we think and talk about free speech. There's a difference, and I want to say that how we understand the issue has a big impact on who gets to speak and how we fight for that. This discourse has been constructed in such a way that it seems to exclude any ability to recognize how racial and sexual minorities don't enjoy the same speech and expression rights as white men. They don't, and that's a problem that we need to solve. But it's also pretty crazy that in the dominant conversation about free speech, nobody is talking about the obstacles that marginalized communities face in exercising speech rights. It's a serious problem, I think, that the free speech conversation is raging across the country and getting invoked to apply to all kinds of new situations daily, but that the mainstream discussion feels no real need to acknowledge the biggest historical and ongoing harms to speech. Okay, so that brings me to the second thing I want to talk about. This isn't working. Which is the proposition. The clicker's not working. Anyone know how to work this PowerPoint? The second thing that I want to talk about. Yeah, this isn't working. Oh, well, this is changing in the. Click on that. Okay. The second thing I want to talk about is the proposition that we hold on to the ideal of free speech, at least long enough to have a real conversation about what it would look like to extend this freedom to everybody, which hasn't happened yet. And I think we have to imagine it. And I'll say more about that ideal in a minute. But third, throughout this talk, I want to emphasize the importance of always asking who is speaking and why. What are the challenges to speaking in any given situation? What kind of silences do we hear? So on this issue, I really think it's worth holding on to the ideal behind the debate. First, because looking at the ideal itself makes it clear that it doesn't apply to everybody right now. And I'm suggesting that we take the most traditional understanding of the ideal of free speech at face value and really imagine distributing it equally, and that we ask everyone to get on the same page about that goal. So I don't actually think that there's much disagreement about what the principle of free speech is in theory. The highest value of free speech is self-expression. It's the ability to express yourself and articulate your opinions and ideas without fear of punishment or retaliation or suppression or death. And it sounds really great. It's a beautiful ideal. And as you know, the First Amendment is the part of our Constitution that is most explicitly tasked with the protection of this ideal. It also protects related freedoms. It acknowledges that free speech is closely related to freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. And together, these freedoms amount to a right not only to say what you want and express yourself, but also to be in relation with others, to form community and organize and speak together about what you want or believe. The limiting principle is harm to society or the state. In other words, when speech does that kind of harm, we won't allow it. But otherwise, this right will protect the right to be who you are, including being in kinship and community, including political community with others. Now, there's a couple of other freedoms that are law groups with this value. They include freedom of the press, which is the right to have information communicated to the public, to know things collectively about our society and government, and then also freedom of religion, which is closely connected to the right to be who you are, believe what you believe, and express that belief. So, for example, the government can't persecute anyone for being a Quaker or a Catholic, and I think a fair way to think of this freedom is that it's what Anglo-Americans, who were quite self-consciously establishing a republic of and for white men in the late 18th century, thought of as protecting diversity within their society. And the correlation of religion with diversity in early America suggests that inherent in this monopoly of First Amendment rights, as the founders conceived of them, is the protection of diversity, that a free society is one where different groups can be themselves and express themselves collectively and individually. And it's this freedom that's understood to be the foundation of all other freedoms. There's some quotes from Ben Franklin and Justice Cardozo that attest to the preeminence that these values have, in theory, been given in American law. And I don't think that they're wrong to suggest that the ideal of free speech and freedom of expression and association boil down to the ideal of freedom itself. And that's why I think it's so important to spend some time to really think about what it would mean to extend this freedom to everyone. So what is the problem of free speech in America? Because the ideal is one thing, but we have a lot of disagreement about what things look like on the ground, especially about who can speak, who is it that's free to speak and express themselves, and then also what are the biggest threats to speech and expression and association right now. And I want to point out that it isn't going to be possible to reach a consensus about where to go with this issue in the future if we don't have any common understanding of what the problem is, where the obstacles to free speech in the present are. And I think both the actual state of things and our disagreement about them are a consequence of American history. So here's who created these rights. Over the last 200 so many years, the United States changed from a nation that proudly avowed its white supremacist patriarchy to one that has come to disavow these things. And if this right ever protected the social value of diversity, I don't think it does now, which is to say that it did not adapt well to all the demographic changes in the landscape of the groups considered to be rights-bearing citizens in this country since essentially the abolition of chattel slavery. The country's self-narrative as a sexually progressive and multicultural society came with a lot of changes in constitutional rights, as they were understood to apply to racial and sexual minorities concerning enfranchisement and beyond. But neither the judiciary nor the legislature ever really rolled up their sleeves and said, wait a minute, we need to seriously rethink speech rights and how they've never been available to all these people before. And these groups never really significantly sought their freedom under the banner of the First Amendment. The ideals of the freedoms I just described never became the focus of a significant, sustained campaign for minority rights. Instead, as you know, the fight by these groups for freedom has largely focused on the principles of equality and anti-discrimination. Legally, it's taken place through the 14th Amendment rather than the First, and that means that the freedom struggle for racial and sexual minorities has been framed as the right to be free from discrimination or unequal treatment. The message is don't kill us, don't harm us, don't kick us out of your restaurants and stores and places of employment. It's been framed as a negative rather than a positive right. And the idea is similar, but it's not quite the same as the right to live your life, to love who you love, to be who you are, to be in with or in kinship with others, not just politically and sexually, but also in chosen families and birth families. Because if we get back to basics, and we should get back to basics, one of the greatest violences enacted during the histories of colonization, enslavement, deportation, and heteropatriarchy in America has been the assault on kinship and people's ability to stay with their families or form families. And this destruction of kinship, or the possibility of kinship, has left a lasting impact and legacies of trauma on many communities that has made it very hard to be both who you are and to be together. So meanwhile, litigation over speech rights, First Amendment rights, has gone on in a very specific register. And I had limited space, so I didn't include cases about libel, obscenity, free exercise, or freedom of the press, but here are some of the big cases about speech and assembly. We've got cases about anti-war speech, the Pledge of Allegiance, a KKK rally, Nazis in Skokie, and flag burning. And you can sort of see what they're not about, right? And what they are about continues to be infringements on speech rights that affect white men. They might also affect others, so other groups could also hold rallies and burn flags, but it is not really about speech rights. They are not really about speech rights that do not affect white men. And again, the white male majority in governance never stopped to consider how to address long histories of violent oppression or adjust itself to ongoing realities. And that's par for the course in American law. But the consequence for the free speech conversation is that the ways that racial and sexual minorities are unable to express themselves are not seen as relevant to it. And the obstacles to these freedoms that these groups face are not viewed as an issue of speech, expression, or association. They are ignored in popular conversation about these things. So, who can speak? If we go back to what the ideal behind these rights is, though, we can see that this exclusion really isn't right, that those ideals compel us to recognize that racial and sexual minorities still face many challenges that are fundamentally about speech, expression, and association. And we know this. We know this in a fundamental and basic way. We know that speech suppression happens unequally. We know very well that many people, simply because of who they are, cannot easily say what they want or even walk down the street in many places in this country without fear of being harmed for who they are. We know that under policies like stop and frisk, black and brown people can't walk down the streets that they live on without being profiled and harassed by police. And although the justification given for stop and frisk, like police and prison brutality and Muslim surveillance, is security, we know that no evidentiary basis that these measures further this interest can be shown. And a recent study in the Times repeats what's been repeated more times than we can probably even stand to hear again, which is that disproportionate arrests of black and brown people have zero correlation with rates of drug use in those communities versus white communities, or with numbers of complaints to the police in those communities. So what it shows is that stop and frisk is a perfect example of racism as a police practice, and these practices are chilling to speech. We know that parents have to have conversations with their children about how to speak to the police. That to teach their kids to try to stay alive, parents have to literally instruct them about how to de-escalate situations that they played no role in creating, where to look, where to put their hands, not to move suddenly, and to never reach in their pockets. We know that black and brown people have to think twice before knocking on a door for help because they were in a car accident, that no matter what they do, there are still going to be consequences, very serious consequences for just being who they are, and that they might be confronted with the violence of state and local law enforcement or vigilante racists in all kinds of institutional and non-institutional settings. And I don't really need to rehearse the list of things that people cannot do while black without fear of arrest or worse, but you know that it includes going into a Starbucks, or taking a nap in a lounge in the dorm at your own university, or wearing a hoodie, or playing loud music at the gas station, or shopping at a vintage store or Macy's or anywhere, or being a kid in a playground, or entering your own home. We also know that it's dangerous, even deadly, to so much as verbally assert your rights. We know from watching the video of Eric Garner's murder that if you are him, you could not tell a cop to leave you alone for selling loose cigarettes. And we know the penalty for this kind of speech is very, very high. That if you're black, you can die for this kind of speech, and even more, that the person who kills you can do it with impunity. And we know from the example of Ramsey Orta that you are far more likely to go to jail for filming a police murder like this and talking about it, for telling people about it, than for committing the murder itself. And my point is a very, very simple one, which is that the pattern of these regular occurrences in this country, this pattern of violence chills speech. It chills expression and association, and it keeps you from living your life and makes it harder to stay in your community. And even more obviously, you can't speak if you can't breathe, and you can't speak if you're not alive anymore. And it's very hard to hear a person speak from a prison cell. Obviously, there are very high barriers, not only to speech and communication, but also to maintaining your family and community in prison. And again, this is not only a speech and association issue, but it is also a speech and association issue. And there's very little that can literalize such barriers more plainly than the physical structure of the shoe. But these barriers are also inherent in the very construction of the prison cell and all of the lack of freedoms within the carceral institution, the geographical isolation of prisons, the difficulty your family faces in getting there to visit you, the burdens placed on prisoners, their families, and attorneys, and the rules concerning visitation. Prisoners and their visitors are subjected to violations of bodily integrity because of visits more routinely all the time. Rates for in-state phone calls from prison rose as high as $56 for 4 minutes before the FCC placed a cap on the rates that telecom companies could charge. So compare that to just a few cents per minute that most of you pay, and the fact that prisoners are still unpaid for their labor in many states. And where they are paid, the average pay for non-industry prison jobs is just 86 cents an hour. So telecom companies are still fighting these rate capping rules in the courts, and under Trump, the FCC has abandoned its defense of them. And that means it's really, really hard to talk to people you love ever from prison, and it could get harder. And how can we fail to understand what is at stake here as anything but a right of association and speech? The carceral environment only highlights how individual speech affects the violence that they experience. How many prison and police beatings and killings follow from people's choice to speak back to police or prison guards? What I saw when defending prisoners in disciplinary hearings is that there is a very high cost for such speech and outside of such institutions. Think again about Eric Garner and Ramsey Orta. We also know that you're a lot more worried about being safe in the streets or at the mall or at work or anywhere if you're a woman, if you are gender non-binary, if you are gay, or if you are trans. We are in the throes of a Me Too and Time's Up moment when everyone other than women, non-binary, queer, and trans people are learning how pervasive gender and sex-based violence is, and also how disproportionately it affects people of color who are also sexual minorities. Again, much of the focus in the media and definitely in the lawsuits is on physical violence, on assaults and murders, and on coercion in the employment arena, all the careers ruined, halted, aborted by this kind of violence and harassment. And one thing I think is interesting is that the biggest shock for some people has been how long, how many of these stories, how awful the stories are that have been suppressed. Who is surprised by these revelations and who is not? Who, on the other hand, is surprised that the silence is breaking? Who was so accustomed to this kind of pattern silencing that we have to admit that some part of us is surprised that anyone finally wants to make them public, that a general public might actually want to do something to make the violence stop? We're looking again at ubiquitous structural violence that is at its core linked to the possibility of speech and expression. And we already understand a lot about this silence, even if we haven't linked it to conversations explicitly about the suppression of speech. What's more, everyone knows that intersectionality means that people of color, and especially poor people of color, suffer the highest incidence of gender and sex-based violence and silencing, and still these stories are not at the center of this movement. The close tie between structural violence and silencing plays out again in the marginalization and the struggle for visibility of trans, non-binary, queer people, and women of color in the media and organizational responses to Me Too and Time's Up. So all of these actionable harms that were never acted on, what did we already know to understand why these lawsuits were never brought? This long silence isn't surprising if you think about the unevenness of the risks and calculations that people face on a daily basis for saying the wrong thing or acting the wrong way. Women and non-binary people, trans people, and queers have developed extremely specialized knowledges about measures to take to try to minimize the incidence of violence to which they will be exposed. And the unevenness in the distribution of these kinds of risks and fears is captured in an old Margaret Atwood quote about men and women's greatest fears, which says that men are afraid that women will laugh at them, or women are afraid that men will kill them. And we see exactly this combination of violent rage coming out of the aggressive, toxic masculinity of the incel community and the humiliations that they perceive. And also in the recent high school shooting in Texas, where a young man decided to go on a rampage and kill a 16-year-old girl who rejected him after he stalked her for months, along with 9 others. And people have had to try to survive this kind of violence. So on a visceral, everyday level, this violence is intimately linked to speech and chills people's ability to express themselves, to be themselves, to dress and behave and walk where and when they wish, alone or with the company of their choosing. For a moment about the speech rights imperiled by the bathroom and driver's license bills that are cropping up across the country to attack trans people's ability to be. What happens to the disability rights attorney who is no longer permitted to use the bathroom in courthouses under such a bill? To an HIV specialist who works at the county health department and who does HIV prevention work in public schools? What about an activist who gives testimony at the State House and at City Hall and holds rallies in public parks? As my friend Gabriel Artless has put it, you can't speak if you can't be in the world, and you can't be in the world in public if you can't use the bathroom. We have to admit that the kind of protective gestures and acts that we engage in are calculations about situations not really within our control. This genre of violence is about who people are, and trying to avoid it often amounts to efforts not to be or to hide oneself. Nathaniel Frank had a Vice article as Trump was elected that along with the concrete policies prohibiting discrimination against LGBTQ people that were at risk, he wrote, "There is another layer of gains, perhaps more subtle but every bit as crucial to the improvement of LGBTQ lives, that are also put at risk by the rise of Trump and what he represents. The full throttled freedom to be and express ourselves as we truly are. This focus on authentic expressive liberty, on the power of words and other forms of communication to shape the reality of our lives in unique and profound ways has been one of the most enduring contributions of queer thought to American culture." So to sum up, what I'm saying to you is that violence that targets minorities chills the speech. But it's hard to organize around this kind of violence as a free speech issue. It makes perfect sense that we organize instead around murders, police brutality, stop and frisk, mass incarceration, the violence of unnatural death and injury and human caging. This is a triage situation. It makes sense to rush to staunch the flow of blood. Of course, we're preoccupied with demanding that the state and private citizens stop killing people, that the state stop sanctioning that, and then the state stop putting people in prison and subjecting them to torture, stop racial profiling, that people stop discriminating against others in employment and healthcare and schools and popular media and every imaginable institution and sphere of life. Of course, we're focused on these things. But the fact remains that when violence occurs because of who someone is, at bottom, these issues also concern the fundamental right to express oneself, to be oneself and be in one's community. And this is why the question of who can you hear in these debates is very important. Who can you not hear? When you find a silence, you don't have to look far to see the structural violence that has historically produced it and is continuing to produce it. And that, to me, is the problem with free speech. The violence that keeps so many from even participating in the conversation about free speech because they're so busy trying to survive. So let's talk a little bit about free speech and the law. If these are the problems that constitute the issue of free speech, then how do we address them? And how do we deal with free speech is right now conditioned largely by the law, and unfortunately narrow, uncreative lawyering. As I've been saying, even the way we talk about the issue of speech, to me, indexes how far we are in this country from achieving the ideal of freedom of speech and expression for all. There's 3 points I'd really like to make about free speech in the law today. The first is what First Amendment actually looks like now. What the law actually does do about free speech, quite apart from the ideals I've been talking about. What courts determine speech rights to be in practice, what actually brings the legal parameters of these rights into being, is in one respect very simply about money. Who can bring a lawsuit to defend their rights determines what interests that a court articulates will be. Who has the resources to fight it out? It's always been true that lawsuits are very expensive, time-consuming, and that the legal system requires a lot of specialized knowledge to navigate. And this is precisely why distribution of legal resources on this issue is so important. These monetary and particular knowledge resources generally do not belong to the communities whose speech rights are most impacted by structural violence. So what determines what the law becomes isn't where its violations happen or even whose arguments have merit, but money. And on top of the fact that wealth determines what gets litigated and whose rights get defended, the court has explicitly tied wealth to speech and power by recognizing corporate speech rights. In Citizens United, it recognized financial contributions towards political elections as speech protected under the First Amendment. And the consequence of recognizing corporate speech rights has been that a large and growing percentage of First Amendment lawsuits now actually concern corporate deregulation. These lawsuits are making it easier for corporations not to put warning labels on their products, for example, because of free speech. So in a nutshell, the principle of self-expression and community building through wealth has become solidly enshrined as a value in legal practice, even beyond the fundamental barriers to who can bring a lawsuit in the first place. So that's where First Amendment litigation is right now. The second thing I want to talk about goes back to my belief in the importance of the ideal. What I'm asking is how we could try to make it possible for marginalized communities to speak and express themselves freely. And this is a very different project from the proposal that we try to limit speech. Recently, some people published an article saying that because of my views on speech, I typify the new authoritarian left. And they construe the fact that I criticize colorblind notions of speech, free speech, meaning ideas about free speech that don't take into account the kinds of harms that I've been describing, as evidence that I would like to limit the racist speech of white heterosexual males to achieve a socioeconomic political power balance. It's there on the right. This is an inaccurate reading of my op-ed. There's a difference between what I'm saying and the only counter-argument that these authors seem to be able to imagine. When I say that the ACLU doesn't need to use their money to defend white supremacists, that's different from me saying that nobody should. And this has very much, again, to do with the distribution of resources for litigation, which I was just talking about. White supremacists don't have trouble getting lawyers these days. It's a very well-funded and highly organized movement. And now I do have a lot of colleagues and friends who are engaged in thinking about how to limit hate speech. And I agree that hate speech is dangerous. I am coming from a different angle, in part because I have genuine concerns about giving the state more powers of censorship. I think it's a really tricky question. But primarily, I'm coming from a different place because I don't think it's the most useful place to start. As you've seen here already, I think that it's far more than hate speech that works to chill the speech of minority communities in this country. Many other kinds of violence make it hard for people to be themselves and live their lives with each other without fear of being harmed for doing just that. I think that hate speech does chill speech and association, and Mari Matsuda has been pointing out for years the real harmful effects of speech, and also the way that hate speech is a gateway into other kinds of violence. And it's a similar point, I'm just beginning from the other end. I imagine that if we could do away with some of this real structural violence, that might be a way of diminishing hate speech. And I think that hate speech might just as often be the symptom as the cause. So when I point out that communities don't have equal speech rights, what I'm asking is, how do we protect more speech and make more speech possible for those who face greater obstacles to these freedoms than others do? And I can't understand why people who consider themselves to be advocates for free speech would not totally embrace this agenda. Just as a side note, the same issue of this journal, which is called Society, also had a number of articles, I noticed, with analyses about whether or not to designate Antifa as a street gang or a terrorist group. And it may seem comical, but these kinds of designations have real force. They have real consequences. They open up new possibilities for prosecution, and if enacted into law, will certainly chill and violate people's speech and association rights. So much for caring about protecting political speech. The third thing that I wanted to talk about was the limitations of the First Amendment. More accurately, it's the limitations and capacities of the First Amendment. If you really want to protect speech, if you really want to get at the problem of unequal access to these freedoms, we're going to need to look at more tools than the First Amendment. Because there's a lot of things that the First Amendment can't do. There's a lot of situations that it can't reach. Just as a basic background matter, you probably already know this, but you know the law only addresses government suppression of speech. So private entities traditionally can say, you can't speak here, we won't allow you people to be here together like that, and that's fine. And we do have anti-discrimination legislation that cuts into that and says that places purporting to hold out services to the public, places of public accommodation, like a cake shop, cannot discriminate against you and refuse you services because of who you are. Anyway, to figure out if you have a claim, the first thing we're going to do is look at the speech that's being suppressed and ask, what does the government have to do with it being suppressed? And sometimes it's a really easy question to answer. Let's say you're a Black Lives Matter group or a BDS group or a Unite the Right group, and you apply for a permit with the local government to hold a rally, and it gets denied because of the nature of your group. This is the most obvious kind of case. If you bring a case like this, you're going to win it. But sometimes it's a harder question to answer. And there's lots of examples where the government is playing a role in showing speech or association, but in ways that make it hard to win a case. I've just gone over many, but here is maybe the hardest kind of case. So this is something that happened a few years ago. If you're native and you're homeless on the streets of Albuquerque or Gallup, some teenagers might smash your brains out for fun while you're sleeping. And this has happened more than once, and experience shows that the police will not do anything about it. And like with historical lynchings, it's hard to say if this is private or state violence. It's both. The violence is privately enacted, but it keeps happening because the state essentially sanctions it. And here they work together to create a pattern. But how do you make out a claim about selective government non-enforcement in court, let alone show how this affects a member of this community's ability to have a voice, or to make an argument for how this kind of violence chills freedom of speech and expression? I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm just saying it's very, very hard. And here's another example of a pattern that includes non-enforcement. Take the pattern of law enforcement in protests that is nationwide. We've all seen it. The police show up and riot here to Black Lives Matter protests like they did in Ferguson, Baltimore, Portland, DC. It's more like name a place where they didn't. But they don't show up at all to white supremacist rallies, or they're present to provide protection to members of the rally, or like in Charlottesville, they arrive after the rally is over to arrest anti-racist counter-protesters. So recently, law professor Justin Hansford wrote about the selective sanctioning of white supremacist protests and punishing of anti-racist protesters, especially black protesters, from a historical perspective in the Yale Law Journal online forum. And his analysis to me raises an important question of strategy, so I'm just going to take you through it. He describes how the assembly of blacks has been highly regulated, when not completely restricted, since colonial times through slave codes. And post-Civil War, when all Americans supposedly qualified for de jure First Amendment protections, the Ku Klux Klan formed, the specter of lynchings became constant, and law enforcement officials refused to protect black citizens from these acts of terror, which ensured, in his words, that the newly freed would have little opportunity to exercise their First Amendment rights. And then he tells us, during the Civil Rights Movement, due to the legacy of disregarding blacks' First Amendment rights, the Civil Rights Movement could not simply seek protection of an already equally applied First Amendment. For him, the Civil Rights Movement can actually be understood as an effort to have the First Amendment equally applied for the first time, because in this moment, blacks sought protection from segregationist hate speech in a manner that balanced dignity and freedom of speech interests. So Hansford uses a theory of interest convergence to explain why the Supreme Court did apply limited non-First Amendment protections to civil rights protesters during the 1950s and 60s. It served U.S. interests in the Cold War, to counter communist propaganda about racial terror and anti-black racism in the U.S. I'm sure you've heard some version of this argument before. And the courts did this in a way that did not significantly expand the scope of freedom of assembly, which made it possible for the events that have taken place more recently to happen. And Hansford describes the same pattern I'm pointing to, how law enforcement raised the costs associated with being part of anti-racist movements through patterns of arrest, employment deprivation and surveillance, charging protesters with felonies, targeting anti-racist activists for surveillance, and further classifying them as black identity extremists. And I hear you have an issue about drones in Chicago. I mean, there's all sorts of ways of suppressing, chilling protesters' speech. So, and by contrast, Hansford points to the way that universities spend millions of dollars to ensure security when white supremacists come to speak on their campuses, and the fact that the Unite the Right protesters in Charlottesville were not tear-gassed, they were not met with tanks, they were not shot with rubber bullets, and very few were arrested, despite arriving armed and engaging in full-on assaults of black counter-protesters and killing Heather Heyer. Because the First Amendment results in predictable racialized outcomes that redistribute resources along racial lines, Hansford calls freedom of assembly a racial project, a project that redistributes the freedom of assembly to whites and away from blacks. And so he condemns the First Amendment. For him, it's a sham, a cover for more racial violence in this country. And I don't think he's wrong as a descriptive matter. But as a matter of strategy, I'm interested in seeing what the picture looks like if we hold on to its ideal. If we continue to insist our goal should be freedom of speech and assembly for everyone, and what are the challenges to making this a reality? Hansford identifies the racist partial patterns of law enforcement as a big challenge, when it comes to racist and anti-racist protests across the US. And it is. For me, this is a prime example of the structural limitations of the First Amendment as a tool for protecting speech and assembly rights. The government here, law enforcement, is chilling speech, certain kinds of speech and not others. And the pattern is plain as day, and it can't be refuted. But it's hard to bring an action against them. Why? These actions are occurring at different times in different states. There's a diffusion of responsibility across different police departments. It's just not how lawsuits work. We can't bring a lawsuit against all cities and police departments, any end of the spectrum, and say, well, some of you did this and others of you didn't do this. For me, the important takeaway is that we can see clearly that this is an instance where the government is chilling speech and circumventing the provisions of the First Amendment. And also that just because we can't use that tool, it doesn't mean that we don't still care about the right being violated, right? And as a lawyer, I have to say that this kind of a situation in which you confront the fact that the law is a limited, blunt, imperfect instrument for reaching the values that it purports to hold up, and for solving the problems that you'd like to solve, this is like every day. It's true of literally any law you could name in any area of practice. It's 101. And I think it's a really important thing for non-lawyers to understand, that you can choose what kind of a lawyer you're going to be. You can either be the type of lawyer who takes a kind of case, or you can be the type who's interested in addressing a problem, who's capable of thinking harder about all the other things you can do. And so from a lawyering perspective, these are your choices when a First Amendment challenge is untenable, but speech is getting chilled in clear and drastic ways. You could say, well, hey, that doesn't fit in with our established practice. We're going to ignore this harm because it's too hard to think about and just stick to the kinds of cases we've done a million times and we know we'll win. Or you can think, what else can we do? What other laws and social dynamics are implicated in this? Whose voices need to get heard? Is this something that the legislature can do something about at the municipal or state level, the national level? What kind of research can we do to show everyone that this is a pattern? What effective communities can we engage to show together that this is an issue of public concern? How can we get everyone to care about and start talking about the issue? What are our different angles in? What kind of hell can we raise to change the status quo? You can be a lawyer who wants to understand a problem and address it, and you can reach out to other people and form coalitions on the issue and support a growing movement together. And if you do that, you know that how we think and talk about an issue is everything. And admittedly, it can be a luxury to do this kind of work. A lot of lawyers who work on these kinds of issues are public defenders or legal aid attorneys working on a shoestring budget, doing ambulance chasing work. But a huge organization with deep pockets and offices in every state is well positioned to do exactly this kind of advocacy. So if the First Amendment can't address all the forces that censor communities and keep people from being able to express themselves freely, it's a limited tool when you're interested in making speech free, then what I'm saying to you is that you have to be interested in the limitations and incapacities of the law. And it means asking, how is speech silenced in ways that the First Amendment cannot address? How can we begin to understand the silencing effects of structural violence as a matter of speech and expression and freedom, in addition to all else? But it also means asking, when is the First Amendment not being used in a way that it could? For example, in April, sorry about that. Yeah. I'm not sure if it's it. I can just keep going. Yeah, the presentation's moving on the screen. I don't know. I just keep.
Okay, just keep talking. Let's see if I can.
In April, the NYPD settled a case that a number of organizations filed against it in 2013 for its total suspicionless surveillance of whole communities, with no other reason for doing so than the religion of the people it monitored. For years, the NYPD monitored restaurants, bookstores, and mosques, created records of innocent conversations, and sent paid infiltrators into mosques and student associations, among other places, where those infiltrators attempted to incite people into making inflammatory statements, and where they took photos and notes and took down license plate numbers. But the harms that were reported indicate that this program may have primarily harmed people's speech, expression, and association rights. We can look, for example, to examples of its effects on people from this report. on the impact of this program on Muslim Americans, prepared by the Muslim American Civil Liberties Coalition, the Creating Law Enforcement Accountability and Responsibility Project, or CLEAR, and the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. It's called Mapping Muslims. The authors note that almost all our interviewees noted that appearing Muslim, or appearing to be a certain type of Muslim, invites unwanted attention or surveillance from law enforcement. Said one, "There's always been a sense of stereotyping about dress, but now the veil thing has become more than just about being different. It has become charged with suspicion." Parents are anxious about the effect on their children. A college student said that his parents did not want him to go to Muslim Student Association events or wear his Muslim hat. Another student, who wears the face veil, noted that her mother asked her to stop wearing all black because she worried her dress would draw police scrutiny. And how could we fail to understand this program is affecting self-expression and association? Here's more examples of how the program made people afraid of speaking. Many regular mosque goers have decreased their attendance, and those who attend do so to just pray and leave, looking over their shoulders for eavesdropping spies the entire time. One young woman who's responsible for organizing youth activities in her mosque noted how congregants have internalized the need to self-edit religious Sunday school curriculum. It's very difficult, it's very hard, you just don't know what to say. I have to think twice about the sentences I say just in case someone can come up with a different meaning to what I'm saying. And those we interviewed also expressed concern with how terms and expressions they use in their native languages might literally be translated and misinterpreted by law enforcement. A prominent Queens business owner explained how a common Arabic phrase to denote excitement could be mistranslated into English to convey that one is so excited that he will explode. The business owner explained that such phrases, commonly used to denote emotion, are seldom used anymore. So how could we fail to understand this program as chilling speech? Here's more quotes about how this program made it more difficult for members of the community to associate with one another. The presence of informants who are Muslim or posing as Muslim has made everyone in these communities paranoid and mistrustful of one another, one interviewee explained. Every other store on the street could be an informant. You start wondering about each one. How did this person get his liquor license so quickly? Or how come the cops aren't saying anything about this guy who is well known to be selling alcohol under the table or to minors? And there are countless more examples from this report of how this program bred mutual fear and suspicion within these communities. The authors said, ironically, those who've been approached by the NYPD become objects of suspicion among their own peers. I think it's impossible not to see that rights of speech and expression and association were at stake in this case, and that's perhaps best summed up by this final quote. Interviewees stress that the ever-present surveillance chills or completely silences their speech, whether they are engaging in political debate, commenting on current events, encouraging community mobilization, or joking around with friends. Political organizing, civic engagement, and activism are among the first casualties. Still, neither this lawsuit nor public discourse really focus that much on speech or association rights. Why? This isn't to criticize the amazing lawyers who are on this case. The fact that they made the right choice at the time for what they were doing captures the paradox that I'm trying to talk about here, which is that even though this case obviously so essentially concerns speech and expression and association, those claims would have been hard to win in court. And they would have been hard to win precisely because of the way that we think and talk about free speech. Now, lawyers could conceivably include claims about freedom of speech and freedom of association using the First Amendment in many kinds of lawsuits. Lawsuits about stop and frisk, lawsuits about the obstacles that prisoners face talking to their attorneys and family members, lawsuits about HUD rules that make it harder for family and friends to come in and out of public housing as guests, lawsuits that prosecute individuals for alleged gang affiliations. Any lawsuit for harms that affect a person's ability to express themselves freely and associate with members of their community, even though they are not usually identified as First Amendment violations. And I know lawyers who have been doing this or have tried to do this, and they get the feedback from their colleagues that these claims are not going to be successful because they are untraditional, out of step with the way the public understands free speech and First Amendment rights, and because they have no precedent in law. And they're right about this. That is true of the way the conversation is going now. And I think that this is probably the most important thing I have to say today, which is that the way people think and talk about free speech is something that we can do something about. We can shift the way that we understand free speech. And the way we talk about free speech and the First Amendment has incredibly high stakes because public discourse has the power to change the field against which law can operate. The law lags behind and absorbs popular change, and people will have to change how they think about the issue of free speech in order for the rights of racial and sexual minorities to become legible. And this discourse is definitely going to have to change in order for these rights to ever become legible to a court. So there is a place in changing what the First Amendment is and could be for lawyers willing to take some risks. But the far bigger role to play here and how we can think about and work to realize free speech for all is for the movement. And lawyers who work with communities know this. They know that there's no way to win these kinds of fights without the movement. And it's within our power to create the change that could make it possible to make this kind of claim, to make it even possible to win this kind of a claim in courts. And transforming the very idea of what the right to free speech can and should mean, it means letting go of very old habits of thought and old accepted ways of talking and creating new ones, and it's work for everybody. So the op-ed I wrote about Charlottesville last summer, this is actually the reason I wrote the piece. I was listening to what people were saying about free speech, and I was disturbed by the tone of the discourse. I heard commentators saying that people were wrong to criticize the ACLU for defending the right, and also Milo Yiannopoulos, and that if people were criticizing these decisions, it was because they didn't understand how free speech works. They didn't understand the law, they didn't understand what was best for them, or how to protect their own freedom, and they should leave it to the experts to take care of it all. And to me, this sounded very condescending, but also wrong. This is the worst time, politically speaking, for people to check out and leave the fight to the lawyers. Lawyers have a role to play. But things are dire, and we need everyone to get involved. And I wanted to say that you can be a lawyer, you can understand the law and still disagree with these choices. And in my view, the way this conversation about free speech was happening and still is happening does nothing more than put up a defensive shield against any other way of thinking about the problem. What I wanted to say then, and what I want to say again now, is that these experts are trapped in the narrowness of the case law with which they're working. And they should listen to what communities of color are telling them about speech rights in America as they experience them. And I think that lawyers and experts could learn a lot about speech and harms to speech and expression from the experiences of those who are routinely silenced by many different forms of structural violence. Violence that is traditionally not seen as having any relevance to the question of speech or association or assembly, but that could and that should. Because I think that many people already understand racial and sexual oppression in terms of speech. I think that people already know that structural violence is silencing. And I've rehearsed a lot of examples of this kind of violence here, which you already all know about. And these are the obstacles to speech and expression, to people's ability to speak, express themselves, be in community. And we should be clear that just because these are resilient communities and the source of some of the most powerful expressions in American politics does not mean that they should bear the burden of the obstacles to expression that they do. And these obstacles, for some reason, are not part of the free speech conversation. And not only do I think that they should be as a matter of accuracy, again, as a strategic matter, I think that this is something we can do. We can take back this conversation. We can do it more easily than we can pass hate speech legislation, for example. And as I've already said, the way that we think and talk about free speech can have material and even legal effects. And the alternative, if we abandon this discourse, we will leave a concept and idea of free speech that has racial and sexual minorities' interests carved out of it, so that the concept will represent only the interests of white men. And that's what we're looking at right now. And it explains who's talking and how they're talking and why litigation looks the way it does. So I want to call these free speech advocates bluff, because if you care about protecting speech, and if you really believe in free speech for all, and you care about everything that I have talked about for the last hour or so or more, and more, you'll want to pay attention to how access to speech and expression and association is drastically unequal in this country and has always been. And it's been time to reassess and think about what it would mean to really try to make these rights no longer privileges that one group enjoys above all others, and to make them available to everybody else. To start to always ask, whose voice are you having trouble hearing and why? And insisting on speech and expression and community for all is like asking for everything. The demand for free speech, if we take this ideal seriously, is at bottom the demand to be free. not just to not be killed, not to be assaulted, violated, or imprisoned, but to ask to be free, to be unfearful of being ourselves, to be able to be together in safe communities. We should see all fights against the violence of the state and private institutions and actors as fundamentally about this ideal. The people who've been oppressed are asking for everything. They've been asking to be free for a long time. And it's time to recognize that there's no right in America that isn't going to be a part of that project, that isn't going to need to be reconceived in terms of that project, least of all free speech. I think it's time for everyone to get on board. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Comment?
I'll ask a question. I know I was the one that laughed loud. I really appreciate a lot of your points. So what do you say to people who, like I have a friend who just donated to the ACLU, and like donate to the ACLU. Like, how would you answer that?
I mean, free speech work is a very, very tiny percentage of what they do. And the ACLU is doing a lot of really amazing work. It's just a huge organization. There's, I don't know how many lawyers the total count is. It's enormous. It does all kinds of work, and it's really important work. They also have received $100 million in donations in the last year or so. And so what I usually say is that they're less in need of your donation than lots of other great organizations doing different kinds of work, more risk-taking work. There's usually people donate to the ACLU because they haven't heard of any other organization or they're not familiar with the organizations doing the work on the ground. And so I know a lot of people who put together lists of organizations that people could donate to depending on what issues they care about the most. I'm happy to disseminate lists like that to people who are looking for places to put their money because there's plenty of places that need their support.
So can you supply on this free speech issue?
On the free speech issue? On the free speech issue, it's hard, I think. The free speech issue is hard because a lot of the outfits that work on the issue of free speech are doing First Amendment litigation, and it looks very traditional the way it's always looked. I don't know that there's really creative organizations working on the free speech issue. What I've heard more of is people who are doing different kinds of civil rights work, who are attaching or trying to attach free speech claims or to try to raise free speech issues when they're advocating for their clients. That's sort of how it's happening in this diffuse, scattered way. I think the time is right for a more centered, creative, well-funded project to take this on. I was hoping that the ACLU might, because they're obviously invested in the idea of free speech and they are so famous for it, They have a lot of resources. And maybe they still will, it's hard to tell. But the McKnight Institute, I think, is starting to do this kind of research and to try to put some of the data together because it's very hard to assess what the landscape of speech rights looks like, particularly in the realm of academic freedom, given stuff on the internet and trolling. There's just a lot more information that we need, I think, to know what's going on and what's moving. So they're beginning to do some of this work, I think. I don't know how much active litigation they're going to do around it, but certainly in terms of the research, they're starting. Yeah.
I guess this question is informed very much by the way that the very frustrating conversation about these issues has evolved on this campus specifically. And I guess it's about sort of, you highlighted, you had the slide with the dollar signs and the money, but that allows people to pursue litigation. But I think the term free itself is also part of the problem. And it's not a coincidence on this campus we're sitting 3 doors down from the Milton Friedman Institute, and that's, here there's a kind of radical free market ideology that informs part of the conversation, and there's this notion that, and I think that also really needs to be part of the pushback as well, is to say, well, precisely if you describe this thing as a free market of speech where supposedly everybody has access, then you've already also described the inequalities that structure it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that those things are totally bound up and should be part of the same conversation. Yeah.
So thanks so much for that talk. I think this is really wonderful and so lucidly put together. I guess like I'm just trying to think along with what you were saying about the resistance on the part of an organization like the ACLU, or just sort of in a sort of larger kind of liberal public discourse, the kind of resistance to accepting this sort of expanded, or in my opinion, extremely reasonable account of what it would look like to have the liberal value of free speech functioning. And I get the sort of one part of your account of that resistance was a sort of kind of legal exigency, right? It's like it's just difficult for lawyers who are already overworked, or who are, where there's a kind of, there are already these sort of grooves in the legal apparatus that just sort of free speech is for this, 14th Amendment is for this, and then there's a sort of, another aspect to it. But I guess my question is sort of like, what beyond that is if you have an account of that resistance? Because to me it feels very brittle, right? The sort of way that the ACLU came out before Charlottesville and then completely, changed the tune after Charlottesville. And so there's something to me a little bit more pathological about the way that the kind of centrist liberal public discourse around free speech clings to the idea that isn't just like, oh, they haven't heard these novel ideas, right? Or that there's something a little bit more overprotected. And I just sort of wonder if you have thoughts about like what it will take to kind of get them to sort of see things your way.
Yeah. I actually think that in part it is because they haven't heard this account very much. I mean, people have simply not, very robustly participated in this conversation, partly because it's so unpleasant and it's so narrow. It just happens to be this national conversation right now, so I actually think there's room to introduce these kinds of ideas. I think more and more people are raising these kinds of ideas. I'm not the only one. And so I think the conversation is slowly changing. I think it could change faster. I think for the ACLU, the pushback, they would say that they didn't make a policy change around Charlottesville, even though most people understand their announcement as an announcement of a policy change. They would say that it wasn't a policy change, and I think for them, the way they handled the whole issue was really in terms of it being a PR disaster. They were just really worried about containing it. They wanted whatever conversation that was going to happen about how to deal with the issue of free speech to happen internally, and to whatever extent that they do have that conversation, I want to respect that. It's possible that they're, I think it would take a lot for their sort of their proud tradition of defending Nazis and white supremacists for that line to change, but I think it already shows in the sort of I don't think that they would represent a Unite the Right group in the same way again, for example, so they may just make different choices in the future. In terms of the national conversation, I think it's a lot, but I think that some of the resistance is coming precisely from what I was talking about. The way that the conversation is going right now is about speech rights that primarily affect white men. And if they affect other people, they do it incidentally. And I think that's some of it. I think they're like, this is our right. This is our right. It's the first right. Let us have it. And they feel that they own the conversation. There's a lot of pushback because another side is coming out and forcing them to reevaluate it, and they're not letting go very easily. And so far, they really have dominated in the published discourse. Like I just haven't seen a lot of media that has taken another attack. That may change. We may see that change. Again, it's happening a little too slowly. I don't know. There are really very old ways of thinking. I thought it was really interesting the responses that I received to the op-ed. The published discourse was pretty much all didn't understand what I was saying in the way that I described here. They all pretty much construed me as being for a hate speech exception and just trashed that position without reading a little more carefully. I thought that was very telling. I received about 100, maybe a little more than 100 emails to my work account, and I would say about 80% of them were, they were beautiful. They were beautiful to nice, They were like, either like, this is something that had to be said, thank you for saying it, from attorneys, from all kinds of people, to really beautiful things like, I There was one from a community college teacher who said, I couldn't make this issue feel relevant to my students until your piece came out. I got one from someone who said, I'm a single mother with 3 kids under 5 and no time for thank you notes usually, but this just resonated so strongly with me. So they were really beautiful. And then I got a handful that were confused and asked me questions, and after I saw how intractable the opposition was to having a conversation, I decided to have that dialogue and write back to every one of them to try to answer their questions and work it out. But the 12 or so that I got from people who just hated the piece all began with a line like, it is unbelievable that someone of your education could hold this view, or it is, it's incredible that someone of your intelligence could, they were so exactly the kind of condescension that I was describing. It was all this attitude of, if you have had an education, or if you are an intelligent person, you couldn't possibly disagree with me. And so I think that there is just a lot of defensiveness that's coming from that posture, like a lot of investment in that posture of knowing better and knowing right, that is making it very, very hard for people to put that down. It's a really emotional investment, I think.
I was just going to ask, this is obviously such an American problem in a lot of ways. It has a lot to do with American history, but are there models or ways in which this is happening in other countries, and obviously with different legislation, different litigation, that could serve as kind of at least a way of thinking through alternatives?
I'm not really that knowledgeable about that. I know that this conversation is happening in most other countries.
Yeah.
So for sure the conversation is happening. The laws are different, and there are hate speech exceptions in Germany, for example, and a few different countries in Europe. And Glenn Greenwald had a piece where he pointed out that oftentimes that legislation is used to prosecute people of color, people on the left. And that's, I think, the concern that people have about enacting similar legislation here. Like, the right is very good at mobilizing arguments for whatever purpose. Like, they're mobilizing equal protection on behalf of fetuses. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're aligning anti-abortion activists with Abraham Lincoln. Like, they have a genius for doing this, and the law is a malleable instrument, and it's open to everyone. And so that's one reason why I wish that lawyers on the left would be more creative and aggressive with their lawyering, although granted courts are not, I think it's a little unpredictable, actually. But that's one reason that I think, for me, whatever legal solutions could be possible or even conceivable rely a lot on a major shift in public discourse, in just the ways that people are thinking and talking about these things. This doesn't seem hard to me. This seems within reach. It feels obvious. I don't know if you all feel that it's obvious, but it feels fairly obvious, and it feels like it even fits within liberal paradigms easily, actually. And so I don't really, I think it's just a matter of doing that work and having those conversations. I don't know that they've happened. I think it was an area that was left undisturbed for a very long time and was recently all thrown up in the air, and we see a lot of defensiveness coming out. Those are the loudest voices, but as the dust settles, there's some more views coming into view. And so I think there's something to struggle over right now. I think there's something to win. Yeah.
Just ask about the religion aspect, because that seems to be one area where this view is more familiar, like the discussion of the notorious Muslim ban or restriction on immigration, that it's often discussed as a potential violation of the First Amendment, about being an institution about being an institution about religions. The idea that certain countries are targeted because they're predominantly Muslim populations. So I wonder why, for instance, in the Mapping Muslims case, wouldn't there have been a strong, just prima facie, case simply because it was mosques that were being monitored?
Yes, there was a free exercise claim. Yeah.
But that did not involve the First Amendment. It was through
the free exercise clause is part of the First Amendment.
Yeah.
It's just a very specific part of the First Amendment, and it's distinct from recognition of speech rights or assembly rights or association rights. Yeah. So that was absolutely a part of that case. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I loved your op-ed. You're one of those people that would have written I loved your op-ed sort of emails. I think that a lot of what you're calling for is a shift from a very narrowly juridical conception of free speech to a political conception. And what I mean by that is specifically that within the liberal conception, it always seems to me like the biggest problem is that people think about free speech as the right to voice your opinion, okay? Whereas the political conception or the democratic conception is about free speech is about opinion formation. That is to say, it is the way in which you actually form an opinion. And hence the notion of, assembly and all is so important, or it's such an important democratic right. Not because I have the right to say something I already think, but rather because I learn what it is to think, about our common world, right? About the public through this practice, how appropriate, at least it's not Trump.
It's a
Right, so much for that. So I guess I wanted to ask you then, if one thought about the problem of free speech more in terms of the importance of opinion formation, because when you talk about how these groups, the right to be themselves, the right to be, a lot of that really is about knowing even who you're in community with, right? I mean, if you don't take for granted that you're in community with people just because they have the same skin color or what you take to be the same sexuality or gender or whatever, then a lot of it is about discovering what that is, and that's only through the exercise of free speech. So it would seem to me one would have to, and I think this is all implicit in your approach, that one would have to just like shift the register a little bit more to the question of the importance of democratic politics and opinion formation rather than the liberal, narrowly liberal conception, which keeps it very connected up to the rights of the individual to voice his or her opinion.
I mean, I think that the idea of opinion, the value of opinion formation is already inherent in the notion of the free marketplace of ideas. It's the idea that the best opinions will rise to the top, but also that people will hear them because they are the best, right? So I think that there are lots of different ways to sort of flesh out or construe or understand this right. With most rights, it's going to be the case that the way that they get parsed will be different for different people who invoke them or who embrace them or who support them. And obviously here, I am trying to reach wider and get to a conception of free speech rights that is not only about having and expressing and forming an opinion, but fundamentally about the right to be who you are, which didn't come into question when the right was first articulated as a part of the Constitution, because that was not really something that was in question for white male citizens at the time that the right was first drafted. And so, but I think that inherent in all of the values that the different parts of it, that whole panoply of rights that I was talking about, purport to protect, that you can see what the grain of that is the right to be who you are in community and to form community. And I think what you're saying about the right to form an opinion or protect the process of forming opinion has to do with all of that and is part and parcel of that. I would just take it even deeper, I think, and just say that there is this way that I don't think it was ever imagined that citizens of this republic find their very being threatened to the core in such violently dramatic ways just for being who they are. And I'm saying we're going to have to transfer that understanding into the notion of freedom of speech and freedom of association, because that's what a lot of people are facing.
I'm ready. I'm going to do this. I'm going to just change all the discourse around it. But before I do that, I just want to understand this word chilling. And since I'm not a lawyer, I'm sure that comes from something lawyery. And because I want to promote this idea, I just want to know more about, because I love that structural violence chills speech. Awesome slide. I think that's where I'm going to like start when I start changing discourse around me. But I want to make sure I understand why you're using this word chilling and if it has legal.
Yeah, I think it
stuff.
does come from the legal discourse about it.
So where should I go to understand?
I mean, it's pretty much in every case, First Amendment case.
Ever.
I don't know.
I mean, it's a word that also is in like, when you're talking about like climate, something like women in academia, right, like chilling climate. I mean, it's a word that's been sort of taken over as like chilling effect as in, because some people on us.
So if it's like in all the cases, why is it such a pipe dream to, just because structural violence, that's the part that's the pipe dream. Got it, thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot, I mean, it is interesting, it would be a good project, I haven't done it, but you could go back into the case law and look at all the ways that they're concerned about speech being chilled. I mean, they're concerned in all kinds of ways. There is one of the civil rights cases that was really good actually, says that if you make public the list of names of members of the NAACP, that is chilling to people's ability to participate in the NAACP, right? So there are lots of expressions that say, we don't want to chill speech. Speech is really important. All kinds of things could chill speech. Here's like a huge range of factors. And so I think if you were to put all those things together, I'm sorry, I don't have concrete examples. I just haven't done that study. But I think it would look even sillier that we're not counting some of the things that so obviously chill speech that I tried to talk about today.
We have time for one more question.
So you've talked a lot about citizens and ground this really nicely in the Constitution and the legal frameworks. I'm wondering about people who don't have as much legal standing in the US, potentially undocumented people and people who are international and citizens of other countries. How do they kind of fit into this framework and discourse, and how do we kind of turn the conversation to also include them within all of this?
I'm sorry, could you ask? You're asking about like undocumented people and international?
Yeah, citizens of other
that don't
countries.
can avail themselves of the protections of the Constitution in the same way?
Yeah.
Does anyone know the answer to whether the First Amendment applies to? I'm looking at you, Sean.
But I don't know that first.
I mean, I think it does, actually. I think the First Amendment applies to everybody, including internationals and undocumented people. I'm trying to think if the case law has tempered that in any way. Like, obviously, it's hard. It's a hard question to answer, in part because it gets so drastically cut back for people under different circumstances. So obviously, if you're in detention or you're in prison, you have like, I don't think that there's a clear articulation that First Amendment rights don't apply to prisoners, but they don't. They just don't, And so that's why that's hard to answer. But I think that outside of those kinds of institutions, First Amendment rights just apply to everybody. Everyone has the right to speak and to assemble and to be part of the protest. Like, you're not going to not be able to use the First Amendment right of assembly you're not going to not be able to invoke it if you attend a protest because you're not a U.S. citizen. That's not the case. So already these things apply. But also in terms of conceiving of this as a broader political right? Like to have a political conception of this rather than a narrow legal conception of this. Obviously those things apply to these groups, and their speech is going to be curtailed and chilled in different kinds of ways that I didn't necessarily talk about today, but you can extrapolate. There's like 1,000 million examples that I didn't talk about today that are, you just have to really think about the violence that structures people's lives, and I would say that that is chilling to speech.
Well, thank you so much.